At 35, Hattie Ellsworth stood in front of a door that had not been opened since the Cuban Missile Crisis, holding an iron key that weighed more than it should have, and a small voice in the back of her mind kept whispering that she had no business being there. The wind off the Blue Ridge moved through the pines behind her in long, slow exhalations. People in Roanoke had laughed when she told them she was leaving. Her former co-worker Dottie had said, over the last cup of coffee in the empty break room of the closed library branch, that a woman didn't go up into those mountains alone unless she was running from something or running to nothing. But what neither Dottie nor anyone else in Hattie's life knew was that the man who had left her this cabin had been waiting for her since before she was born. Before we go any further into this story, if quiet stories about people finding their way home mean something to you, take a moment to subscribe and tell us in the comments what state you're listening from tonight. There is a particular comfort in knowing how far a story has traveled to reach a stranger's window. The key had been put into her palm 3 days earlier by a lawyer in Linville, North Carolina, a soft-spoken man named Porter Aldrich, who wore a cardigan instead of a suit jacket and kept a small framed photograph of his late wife on the corner of his desk. He had pushed a single sheet of paper across the polished wood between them. 3 conditions he had said. She cannot sell the property, she must enter alone the first time, and she must remain through at least 1 full winter. Hattie had read the page twice and then a 3rd time because her eyes kept sliding off the words as if they refused to land. A full winter, she said, hearing her own voice come out small. That's what the will specifies, Porter said. Mr. Harrowgate was very particular. He left no instruction without a reason. Whether he chose to share the reason is another matter entirely. She had asked the question then that had been sitting in her throat the whole flight down from Roanoke. Who was he? Porter had folded his hands together in a way that suggested he had been preparing for that question for some time. His name was Ellis Harrowgate, he said. He was 88 years old when he passed. He lived for most of his life in a small house down the ridge from this cabin. He never married. He had no children. And Mrs. Ellsworth, he was your mother's blood uncle. Hattie had stared at him. Her mother, Cora, had been an only child raised in Tennessee by parents named Bernard and Lucinda Ellsworth, both gone long before Hattie was old enough to know them. There had never in 35 years been any mention of a Harrowgate. Porter had nodded, as if reading her face. He said only that there were things her mother had not been told. He said you might find some of them in the cabin. He said he hoped when you did, you would not judge him too harshly for the manner of the telling. Now she stood on the porch step where one board sagged a little to the left like a tired shoulder. The wind moved again. Somewhere below her in the gravel turnaround, Barnaby, the old beagle she had inherited from her mother, shifted in the passenger seat of the sedan and let out a long soft sound that was almost a sigh. Above the door, carved into the lintel in letters, faded almost to nothing, were 2 words: hold fast. She did not know whose hand had carved them. She did not know yet whether it was an order, a prayer, or simply the name a builder had given to a house that had to last. The iron key was warm in her palm from the heat of her grip. She had been holding it for almost an hour without realizing. She had driven down from Virginia at first light. The sedan was 12 years old and burned oil. The check engine light had come on outside of Whiteville, and she had ignored it because there was nothing in her bank account to fix it with anyway. The settlement from the divorce had taken almost a year to come through, and what arrived was less than her lawyer had promised, and more than her ex-husband had wanted to give, which meant it had been the wrong number for everyone. Daniel had left her 2 years ago for a junior accountant at his firm, who was 26 and had no opinions about whether they ought to have a child. Hattie had spent the last 3 years of their marriage walking through every doctor's office in the Roanoke Valley, trying to find out why her body would not do the one thing she had always assumed it would do without thinking. The answers had been gentle and indirect. Premature ovarian insufficiency, one specialist had called it, with the careful voice of a man who knew the words landed harder than they sounded. She had been 32 then, She had thought she had time. By the time the divorce was final, time, as it turned out, had already left. She put the key into the lock. It would not turn. She leaned her shoulder into the door the way Porter had told her she might have to. The mechanism resisted her in a way that felt almost personal, as if the cabin itself had grown attached to the silence of 63 years and was not yet ready to be persuaded out of it. She worked the key back and forth. Then, somewhere deep inside the wood, the lock gave with a low sound that was not a click, but a long, slow groan, the kind of sound that a body makes when it stands up after a long time sitting down. The door swung inward half an inch and stopped. She pushed. The air that came out of the cabin was colder than the air on the porch, not the cold of late October on a mountain. Older than that, the cold of a room that had been sealed against the world and had grown to prefer it. She stepped across the threshold. The light from the open door followed her in and lay across the floorboards in a long, pale rectangle. Dust hung in it the way dust hangs in a church. She stood very still and let her eyes adjust. A wooden table in the center of the front room was set for two plates, 2 cups, a small pitcher between them dry to the bottom but upright as if its contents had been finished, and someone had only meant to step away from the table for a moment. A man's coat hung on a peg by the door. A pair of women's house shoes sat neatly underneath the kind, with a low heel and a bow across the toe that women had stopped wearing around 1965. A rocking chair faced the cold fireplace at a slight angle, as if its last occupant had stood up to answer a knock. A kettle sat on the iron stove. The wood box beside the stove was half full. The wood inside it had been split by someone long dead. The cabin had not been abandoned. It had been interrupted. She stood in the center of the room a long while. Her own breath was the loudest thing in the building. From the porch, she could hear Barnaby give one short questioning bark, the dog reminding her that he had not forgotten her, even if she seemed for the moment to have forgotten him. She did not move. She had spent her whole adult life learning to read a room before she walked any further into it. Her mother had been the kind of woman who could turn an ordinary kitchen into a minefield of unspoken weather. And Hattie had grown up with the particular skill of a child who studies barometric pressure. She had carried that skill into her marriage. She was carrying it now. And what the room was telling her was that someone had once been very happy here, and then very afraid, and then gone, and that nothing in between had been touched since. On the table between the 2 place settings lay a plain white envelope. She did not see it at first. The envelope was so ordinary that her eye had passed over it twice. The kind of envelope a person buys in a packet of 50 at a drugstore. But the envelope was clean. There was no dust on it. In a room where everything else wore 63 years of soft gray fur, the envelope sat as if it had been set down that morning. She stepped closer. Her name was written across the front of it in dark blue ink. Hattie. Just that. No surname. The handwriting was careful and old. The letters formed by a hand that had been taught penmanship in a one-room schoolhouse and had never let the lesson go. She had not told anyone, not even Porter, the day she planned to come. She lowered herself into the nearest chair because her knees had stopped negotiating with her. The chair creaked under her weight, a sound that was somehow welcoming, as if the chair were pleased to remember what a person felt like. She picked up the envelope. The paper inside was thick and folded twice. She unfolded it slowly. The handwriting on the page was the same as on the front. Hattie, it began. If you are reading this, then the lock has finally yielded, and so must I. She read the first line 3 times before she let herself read the next. My name was Ellis Harrowgate. By the time these words find your eyes, I will have been some time gone. I was your mother's uncle, though she did not know it. And so I am your great-uncle, though you did not know it either. I have been waiting for you, in a manner of speaking, for a very long time. I closed the doors of this cabin in the autumn of 1962 when I was 25 years old, and I did not open them again. I lived the rest of my life in a smaller place down the ridge, where I could see the road because I wanted to know if anyone ever came back. No one ever did until you. I owe you more truth than one letter can carry. But a letter is where it has to begin. Hattie's hand tightened on the page. Outside, the wind moved through the pines again, and she heard a single branch tap against the side of the cabin. 3 quick knocks, like someone politely asking to be let in. You will not know me. The letter continued, and there is no reason you should. I made a choice when I was a young man to step out of the lives of the people I loved in order to protect them from a thing I had done on their behalf. That choice cost me a sister. It cost me in a different way the niece your mother eventually became, and it cost me you until now. Your grandmother was my older sister. Her name was Adaline Harrowgate. She was born in this valley in 1938, and she left it for the last time in October of 1962. She did not take the name Harrowgate with her when she left. She took her 3-year-old daughter, my niece, and she traveled to Tennessee, where she gave that child to a family she had once known. A good family. A family she trusted to raise the girl as their own. The family's name was Ellsworth. Hattie's hand went up to her mouth. The girl Ellis had written was 3 years old when she left this valley. Her birth name was Cora Adaline Harrowgate. The Ellsworths called her Cora as well, which was a kindness because it allowed her to keep the only word about herself she had carried out of these mountains. They raised her well. They loved her. I have no quarrel with what they did. They kept the agreement they made with my sister, which was that the child would never be told. Your mother lived and died, believing herself to be Bernard and Lucinda Ellsworth's only daughter. In every way that matters, Hattie, she was. I am writing to you now, only because the secret, like the cabin, has outlasted the people who had reason to keep it. And there is no one left for it to harm. And there is one person, you, for whom it may finally be a comfort to know. She put the letter down on the table because her hand was shaking, and she could not read further with it doing that. She looked across the room at the coat on the peg. She looked at the woman's house shoes underneath. She thought with a calm that surprised her, those shoes belong to my grandmother, a woman I have never spoken about, never mentioned at a dinner table, never been asked about by a single person in 35 years, because no one in my entire life ever knew she existed, including my mother, especially my mother. She picked the letter back up. Your grandmother Adaline was 24 years old when she left this place, Ellis had written. I was 25. She was the bravest person I have ever known, and she was also the most stubborn, which the two qualities I have come to believe are very rarely separable. She married a man in the spring of 1959 against my advice and against the advice of every woman in the valley who had ever met him. His name was Thaddeus Vale. He was handsome the way some men are handsome, which is to say that the handsomeness was the first thing you saw and the last thing you trusted. He owned a small piece of land down by the river, and a temper that he did not own at all, but that owned him. I will not in this letter tell you what kind of husband he was to my sister. I will only tell you that on a night in October of 1962, my sister came up to this cabin with her daughter in her arms and a cut above her eye, and she asked me to keep them for a few days. I said yes. I would have said yes to anything she asked me that night. And I have spent every year since asking myself why I had not said yes to the things she had been asking me in less direct ways for the 3 years before. A car went by on the road below, somewhere far down through the trees, and the sound came up to her thin and small like a sound from another country. Hattie did not look up. I will not in this letter tell you what happened on the third night that my sister and her daughter were in this cabin Ellis had written. I will not tell you, because the telling requires more room than a letter can hold, and because the telling belongs in a different place from this one. I will only say that something happened, and that by the morning that followed, my sister had made a decision that I did not have the courage to argue her out of, and so I helped her carry out instead. She took your mother to Tennessee. She left her with the Ellsworths. She came back to this cabin one final time in November of 1962 to retrieve a small box of her own things. And then she walked out the door you have just come through. And I did not see her again until I read her obituary in a newspaper in 2009. She was 71 years old. She had lived a quiet life in Asheville. She had worked as a seamstress. She had never remarried. She's buried in a small churchyard there. I have visited her grave 4 times. I have never told anyone, not even Porter Aldrich until now. Hattie set the letter on the table again. She got up. She walked to the front door, and she leaned against the frame, and she looked out at the gravel turnaround where her sedan sat with its hood cooling, and Barnaby's gray head visible through the windshield. The dog was watching her. He had been watching her, she realized, the entire time she had been inside. She lifted her hand in a small wave so that he would know she had not forgotten him. He thumped his tail once against the passenger seat. She turned back into the cabin. The rest of the letter was shorter. I have set this place aside for you, Hattie, Ellis had written. Not because you are owed it, though. In a legal sense, you are. I have set it aside because your grandmother set it aside before you were born, and I was only the keeper of what she left. You will find in time a tin box under the floor of the bedroom at the end of the hall. You do not need to look for it today. You do not need to look for it this week. The box has waited 63 years, and it can wait until your hands are steady. When you do open it, you will find a deed and a notebook in my handwriting, and a letter in your grandmother's, and a small object that belonged to your mother when she was a child. You will also find, if you have the patience to read, everything the name of the place where my sister is buried. I would be grateful if at some point in your life you went to see her, not for her sake. She's past needing visitors, for your own. Because there is a particular comfort that comes only from standing in front of a piece of stone and knowing whose name is on it and saying out loud that you have come. The signature at the bottom was simple. Your great-uncle Ellis. Hattie sat for a long time after she finished the letter. The light through the open door shifted across the floor. A cardinal landed on the porch rail and looked in at her for one long considering second, then flew. She thought about her mother. She thought about all the things her mother had not told her, and all the things her mother, she now realized, had not been told either. Cora Ellsworth had died 4 years ago of a stroke that arrived without warning. In the kitchen of the small ranch house she had lived in alone for the 8 years. After Bernard Ellsworth followed Lucinda into the cemetery in Knoxville. Hattie had been at the hospital within 3 hours. She had held her mother's hand for an entire afternoon and into the evening, and she had said the things you say. She had not in any of those hours known to say, "Who were you really?" She had not known to say, "Where did you come from?" Her mother had not known either, and the not knowing had been. Hattie understood now. Not the absence of an answer, but a quiet that had been laid over her mother's whole life by a woman in Asheville who had loved her enough to give her up, and then loved her enough never to tell her why. She folded the letter. She put it back into the envelope. She walked it over to the rocking chair by the fireplace, and she set it on the seat because the table did not feel like the right place for it anymore. The table was for the 2 people who had once eaten there. The chair was for her. She went back outside. Barnaby lifted his head when she opened the car door. He was 13 years old and his hips bothered him, and he had not been pleased about the long drive, but he allowed her to lift him down out of the seat with the patient resignation of a dog who has decided that whatever his person is doing is by definition what the day requires. She set him gently on the gravel. He took a few stiff steps and then he stopped. His nose lifted, and he turned his head toward the cabin, and he made a small low sound in his throat that was not quite a whine. Old dogs know when a place has been waiting. She had read that somewhere a long time ago, and she had not believed it. She believed it now. "It's all right," she said, kneeling down to put her hand on his back. "We're going to stay here a little while." He looked at her with the watery brown eyes that had been her mother's company in the last years of her life. She lifted him up the porch step where the board sagged. She brought him inside. He walked the perimeter of the front room, the way old dogs do, slowly, deliberately, his nose mapping the corners. He stopped in front of the man's coat hanging by the door. He sniffed the hem of it for a long time. Then he turned and went to the rocking chair, and he lay down on the braided rug in front of it, as if he had been told that was where he was meant to be, and he closed his eyes. Hattie sat down on the rug beside him. She put her hand on his back. She looked at the rocker. She looked at the envelope on the seat. She looked across at the table set for two and at the kettle on the stove and at the pair of woman's house shoes under the coat by the door. The wind moved through the pines outside again, and the cabin gave a small contented creak. Somewhere in its bones, the sound a house makes when it remembers all at once what a person feels like. The light through the door began to turn gold and then bronze, and then to thin out toward blue. She had not eaten since a gas station biscuit outside of Boone. She had not unpacked the car. She had not thought even once in the last 2 hours about the eviction notice on her kitchen counter back in Roanoke, or the unpaid power bill, or the message her ex-husband had left on her phone 2 days ago asking if she had figured out yet what she was going to do with the rest of her life. None of those things had stopped existing. They had only, for the first time in 3 years, stepped behind something larger. She made herself stand up. She lit the lantern Porter had left for her on the porch. The light pushed back the dusk by about 3 feet. She found on a shelf above the stove a small tin of loose tea dry but still fragrant, and she pumped water from the kitchen until it ran something close to clear, and she boiled it on the iron stove with the wood that someone long dead had split. She poured it into one of the 2 cups on the table, the cup on the side nearest the rocker, and she sat down in front of it. The tea was old and the flavor was thin. It tasted like cedar and faint mint and something else she could not place, something that might have been honey once. She lifted the cup. She held it just under her chin so that the steam touched her face. She did not drink yet. She thought about her grandmother sitting in this same chair 63 years ago on a night in early October, before whatever had happened, lifting a cup of this same tea to her face and not knowing that within a month she would be in Asheville with a different name. She thought about her great-uncle, 25 years old, sitting across the table, knowing that the man his sister had married was the wrong man, and not knowing yet what knowing it would cost him. She drank. The tea was warm going down. Barnaby sighed in his sleep. The wind made the lantern flicker once and then steadied. Hattie sat in her grandmother's chair in her great-uncle's cabin, in a valley her mother had been carried out of as a 3-year-old child, and she understood with a slow clarity that did not feel like a surprise so much as a confirmation that she was going to walk down that hallway. Not tonight. The letter had told her she did not have to, but soon. And whatever was in the tin box under the floor at the end of the hall was going to change the shape of every story she had ever been told about herself, and she was going to let it. She set the cup down on the table beside the other cup, the one that had been waiting since 1962, and for a long moment in the lantern light, the 2 cups looked like they had been set there by the same hand on the same evening. Above the door on the outside of the lintel, the words she could no longer see from where she sat held their place in the wood. Hold fast. She had not known when she put the key in the lock what those words meant. She still did not know. But for the first time since Daniel had walked out and the doctors had stopped offering options, and the library had locked its doors, and her mother had become a name on a stone in Knoxville, Hattie Ellsworth did not feel like she was falling. She felt instead like something underneath her foot had finally agreed to hold. She did not sleep in the bedroom that first night. She brought a quilt from the foot of the rocker, the one folded in a way that suggested it had been put there by a hand that liked things tidy, and she made a place for herself on the braided rug in front of the cold fireplace with Barnaby curled against her hip. The fire she did not yet know how to light. The lantern she left burning on the table because the dark inside that cabin when she had blown the flame down to see what it would do had not been the dark of a bedroom. It had been older than that. She did not yet have the muscle in her chest to sit inside it. She woke at first light to a sound she could not place, a kind of soft methodical knocking. For one cold second, she thought of the branch against the cabin wall the evening before, but the rhythm of this was different. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 more. A human pattern. She sat up. Barnaby lifted his head, and made the low concerned sound of an old dog who knew he was past his usefulness as a guard, but felt obligated by long habit. She stood. She crossed the room in her socks. She opened the door. A man stood on the porch with his hat in one hand and a small covered basket in the other. He was in his early 70s, tall and lean in the way mountain men stay lean, with a face that had been weathered by enough seasons to look more like a landscape than a face. His hair under the hat was thick and white. He did not smile exactly, but something in his eyes softened when he saw her. "You must be Hattie," he said. "I'm Walter Briggs. I live about a mile down the ridge. My wife sent breakfast." She stood there in the doorway in her sweater and yesterday's jeans, with her hair on one side flattened from sleeping on the rug, and she did not know what to say. She had not, in any of the months of planning that had led to this cabin, prepared a face for being introduced to a neighbor before she had brushed her teeth. Walter seemed to understand this. He set the basket gently on the porch boards at her feet. "There's biscuits in there," he said, "and some sausage gravy in a jar. Still warm if you eat it quick." Elaine put a tea towel over the top so the dog don't get to it. She held out her hand to take the basket, and her hand, she noticed, was trembling slightly, which was foolish. He pretended not to notice. He fitted his hat back on his head. He said only Elias used to take his breakfast at 6. "We brought it up to him every morning for the last 9 years he was alive. We didn't see any reason to stop on the day after he passed, so we brought it to the porch and we set it on the rail. When you weren't here yesterday, we figured today might be the day." She tried to say thank you. What came out was something smaller. He nodded as if it had been enough. "There's no obligation," he said. "If you don't want company in the mornings, you say so to Elaine in town, and she'll stop sending. She won't take offense. She'll take the time back and find something else to do with it." He paused at the top of the porch step. Above the door, his eyes flicked up to the lintel and lingered for half a second on the carved words, and then came back to her. "Your great-uncle," he said, "was a good neighbor. A quiet man, but a good one. If you need anything that the cabin can't tell you yet, you knock on my door." He went down the steps. He did not look back. She watched him walk down the gravel drive and disappear around the bend. She brought the basket inside. She set it on the table beside the 2 cups that were still where she had left them. She lifted the tea towel. The biscuits inside were still warm. There were 4 of them, more than one person could finish in a single morning, which he understood after a moment was the polite mountain way of saying that the basket had been packed for the possibility of guests who had not yet arrived. The thought made her sit down very suddenly in the rocking chair and put her hands over her face for a full minute, because no one had packed her a basket of anything in 8 years. By mid-morning, she had decided she would try to light the wood stove in the kitchen. She had watched her father do it once when she was small in a hunting cabin he had rented for a single weekend in 1996, and she remembered the principle but not the practice. She crumpled some newspaper she found in a drawer, which turned out to be from May of 1962, and to contain a wedding announcement for a couple she did not know, and she felt briefly guilty for burning it. She laid kindling on top in the rough shape of a tent. She struck a match. The match went out. She struck another. The newspaper caught and the kindling did not. The paper burned down to gray, and the stove sat there with the contented indifference of a piece of furniture that had outlived 3 generations of more experienced hands than hers. She tried again. This time the kindling caught, and the larger pieces of wood she had laid on top of it smothered the flame. She opened the stove door to see what had happened, and a cloud of pale smoke rolled out into the kitchen. Barnaby barked once. She slammed the door shut, and the smoke escaped around the seal and filled the room with a thin gray haze that smelled like every disappointment of her adult life. She sat down on the floor in front of the stove. She did not cry. She had passed crying somewhere around the 3rd doctor in 2022. She just sat and looked at the iron face of the stove and said out loud to no one in particular, "I have a master's degree in library science and I cannot make a fire." She got up. She walked out to the porch. She walked back inside. She sat in the rocking chair. She looked at the envelope still resting on the seat beside her. She picked up the basket and unwrapped one of the biscuits and ate it standing in the front room. And it was the best biscuit she had ever eaten in her life, and that fact somehow more than anything else that had happened in the past 3 days almost broke her. That afternoon, a small white pickup pulled into the drive. Elaine Briggs climbed out of it with the practiced economy of a woman who had been getting out of trucks her whole life. She was 69 years old, and round in a way that suggested a great deal of bread baking and a great deal of laughing, and she carried a cast-iron skillet under one arm and a paper sack in the other hand. "I'm not staying," she said before Hattie had finished opening the door. "But I noticed last night that the chimney didn't smoke once, and I thought I'd come up and see if you maybe needed a hand getting the stove acquainted with you." She set the skillet on the porch rail. She came inside. She did not ask permission. She did it in a way that did not feel like an intrusion, but like an instruction in how to be welcomed. Elaine knelt in front of the stove with the easy creak of a woman whose knees had done that motion 100,000 times. She opened the door. She studied the gray pile inside. She did not say a word about it. She rearranged the wood with her bare hands. She crumpled fresh paper into balls instead of strips. She laid the kindling so that there was air between every piece. She struck one match. The fire took. It took the way a fire takes for someone who has been making fires since 1965, which is to say that it simply began existing as if the stove and the woman had agreed in advance that there was no reason to make a production of it. The trick, Elaine said, standing up and brushing her hands on her skirt, is you have to leave the fire room to breathe. Most folks pack it too tight because they think more wood means more heat. More wood means less air. Less air means more smoke. You let the kindling get going hot and bright before you put the big pieces on. She closed the stove door. She turned. She looked Hattie full in the face for the first time. Her eyes were a pale, steady blue. She said, "Your Uncle Ellis spoke of you exactly twice in the 9 years I knew him. Once on a Christmas Eve when he had a little brandy in him, and once 2 days before he died." Hattie waited. Elaine did not elaborate. She only added, "Both times he said your name like he was glad it existed." Then she went out to her truck and brought in the paper sack, which contained a loaf of bread, a wedge of cheese, 3 apples, and a jar of honey. And she set them on the table beside the cups without comment, and she drove away. In the days that followed, the valley introduced itself the way valleys do, which is to say slowly and without ceremony. A woman named Dolores worked at the small post office at the bottom of the hollow, and when Hattie went down on the 3rd morning to ask about getting her mail forwarded from Roanoke, Dolores looked at her over a pair of reading glasses and said, "You the one staying up at Ellis's place?" And Hattie said she was, and Dolores said, "All right then," and rerouted everything with a kind of practiced indifference that turned out to be the local dialect of welcome. The pastor at the white clappered church at the crossroads, a soft-spoken man named Frank Halverson, stopped by with a casserole on the 5th evening, and stayed exactly 7 minutes and refused tea twice and left without ever asking what brought her to the mountain. A man named Cyrus, who ran the feed store and did some carpentry on the side, drove up unannounced on the 7th day with a board cut to length and replaced the sagging step on the porch without being asked and without sending a bill. And when Hattie tried to pay him, he held up one large flat palm and said, "We'll square up sometime," and got back in his truck. She learned to light the fire. She learned to pump the water. She learned after 2 ruined pots to bake cornbread in the iron skillet Elaine had left behind. She found in a drawer in the kitchen a small handwritten recipe for buttermilk biscuits in a woman's hand that was not Ellis's, and that she understood after looking at it for some time must have belonged to Adaline. The recipe had a small smudge of flour on the corner that had been there since 1962 and that she did not wipe off. She also on the 11th day walked down the hallway to the bedroom at the end of it. She did this in the late afternoon, when the light through the small window at the end of the hall was the color of weak tea. She had been postponing the room. She had told herself she was postponing it for practical reasons, that she did not yet have the steadiness Ellis had asked her to bring to it. But that morning, brushing her hair in front of the spotted mirror in the bathroom, she had looked at her own face and understood that the postponement had become its own kind of fear, and that the longer she let it sit, the larger it would get. She walked down the hall before she could talk herself out of it. Barnaby followed her 3 steps and then lay down in the middle of the hallway and waited the way he had been waiting for her his whole life. The bedroom was plain, an iron bed frame, a chest of drawers, a wardrobe with one door slightly ajar, a braided rug on the floor in the colors of a winter sunrise. She did not look at any of it for long. She knelt on the rug. She rolled it back. The floorboards beneath were just floorboards. At first, dark with age until her fingers found the square seam Ellis had cut into them, with a hand that must have known it would never be the same after the cutting. The square came up easily. The tin box beneath it was painted blue once, and was now the pale gray of something the sun had forgotten. She brought the box out to the front room because she did not want to open it in the place where it had been hidden. She set it on the table. She lit the lantern even though it was still afternoon because the light through the windows had begun to thin and she wanted to see clearly. She lifted the lid. There were 6 things inside. A bundle of letters tied with brown string. A black notebook, the kind a man carries in his shirt pocket. A folded document with the dry, brittle feel of a county seal. A small cloth pouch. A second envelope sealed with no name on the front, and one small object wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed at the folds. She did not unwrap the object first. She unfolded the document. It was a deed. 247 acres on the ridge, legally described in a tight typewritten paragraph signed in 1964, in a woman's careful hand, and notarized by a man whose name had faded to a ghost. The land had been placed not in Adaline Harrowgate's name and not in Cora's, but in a trust with a single-named beneficiary to vest 60 years in the future. Upon her attaining the age of majority and crossing the threshold of the dwelling known as Harrow's Hold, Hattie Adaline Ellsworth, Hattie Adaline Ellsworth. She had been named after her grandmother, by her own mother, who had not known. The middle name on her birth certificate read, Anne with an E after Lucinda Ellsworth's mother in Knoxville. She had used that name her whole life in the small ways one uses a middle name on tax forms and the inside of her marriage license. She had never been told another name. She thought of her mother in the kitchen on the morning of her birth, choosing Adaline out of some pocket of herself she had not known she carried, writing it down on a hospital form, and then in some later year, perhaps when Hattie was 4 or 5, and starting to ask too many questions about words, quietly changing it on the official records to the safer, shorter Anne. Her mother had known and not known at the same time. She had known the way the body knows. She had not known the way a person knows what to say at the dinner table. Hattie set the deed down. She picked up the small object in the tissue paper. She unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a child's silver bracelet, tarnished almost black-sized for a wrist of 3 years old. She turned it in her fingers. On the inside of the band, in letters so small they almost disappeared, the engraving read, C.A.H. Cora Adaline Harrowgate. The bracelet had been put in this box in November of 1962 by a woman who had decided that her daughter could not carry her own name out of the valley because the name was now a thing that could hurt her. Hattie closed her fingers around the bracelet and held it against her sternum, and she sat at the table for a long time and did not move. She did not open the notebook that day. She did not open the sealed envelope. She wrapped the bracelet back in its tissue paper, and she set it on the mantel above the cold fireplace beside the small ironstone vase she had not yet found a use for. And she went to bed in the second bedroom, for the first time since she had arrived, because Barnaby had walked into it that evening and lain down on the rug, and she had decided that he was telling her something she ought to listen to. She opened the notebook 3 days later on a Saturday morning, When she had eaten breakfast and washed the dishes and chopped a small armful of kindling without help, and was beginning to think of herself as a woman who lived in a cabin instead of a woman who was visiting one. She sat in the rocking chair with the notebook in her lap. She read it from cover to cover. It took her almost 4 hours. She closed the notebook when she was done. She put it on the table. She walked out onto the porch. She sat down on the step. She looked out at the clearing and at the line of yellow birches at the edge of it. The leaves now beginning to come down in the slow, patient way leaves come down in late October on a mountain. She did not cry. She had used up her crying on the first day. She just sat there with the new shape of her own family lodged in her chest, like a stone she had swallowed. Her grandfather had been a man named Thaddeus Vale, and he had been a violent man, and he had died in this cabin on a night in October of 1962 by his own hand on a gun he had brought into the room. Ellis had written it down plainly in the way of a man who had decided 60 years earlier that he would not let the telling of it harden into a story. The gun had gone off in the taking of it. Thaddeus had been on the floor of the front room. Ellis had sat with him for an hour. Then he had gone down the ridge to the boarding house in town, where Adaline had been waiting with Cora, and he had told her, and she had made her decision in the time it took to draw 3 breaths, and the rest of his life had been the carrying out of that decision and the keeping of its silence. He had buried Thaddeus on the far side of the ridge, where the creek bends past the cedars in ground he had dug with a shovel he had later burned. He had taken Thaddeus's truck and driven it to the old quarry lake and let it go in. The county had written it down 2 months later that Thaddeus Vale had abandoned his wife and child and left the state. No one in the valley had looked for him. No one in the valley had wanted him found. Adaline had taken Cora to Tennessee. She had given her over to a family she had known once in a different life, a family who had been kind to her when she had been a girl on a school trip, and who had stayed kind through every letter she had sent them in the years since. They had agreed at her asking never to tell. They had also agreed at her insistence to let her go. She had walked out of their Knoxville kitchen on a December morning in 1962, and she had not gone back. Ellis had not seen her face again for 47 years. Hattie sat on the porch step. The cabin behind her made its small, contented sounds of settling. Down at the gravel turnaround, a small brown wren landed on the side mirror of her sedan and looked at itself for one curious second, and then flew. She thought in a clear, flat voice that was somehow not her own. "My grandfather is buried on this mountain. My grandfather is buried on the land that is now by deed mine." She did not know yet what she was going to do with that. She did not have to know yet. The valley did not require her to know. A week passed. She found that she was sleeping better. The wind off the ridge at night had become a sound she did not flinch from. Barnaby's hips were doing slightly better on the colder mornings, which was a thing she would not have predicted, and which she chose to consider a small grace. Elaine came by twice more and taught her without ever describing what she was teaching how to bank a fire so that it would still be warm in the morning. Walter brought her a small split of seasoned oak and stacked it on the porch and did not stay for coffee. Dolores at the post office handed her a forwarded letter on the 17th day and said, "This come for you." And the way Dolores said it suggested that the word "you" for Dolores had begun to include Hattie. The letter was from a law firm in Charlotte. She opened it on the porch in the white late October sun. "Dear Ms. Ellsworth," it began. "We represent Carrick Timber Holdings, a privately held forestry and land development company headquartered in North Carolina. It has come to our attention that the recent transfer of approximately 247 acres of rich property in the vicinity of Linville Hollow has been completed in your name. Our client has been studying this parcel for some years and is prepared contingent on standard inspections to offer the sum of $1,200,000 for outright purchase of the timber rights and surface acreage with the existing dwelling and a 5-acre homestead surround to remain in your possession as you may prefer. The offer is, we believe, generous to fair market and reflects our client's strong interest in the parcel. Please find enclosed a preliminary term sheet. She read it twice. She set it on her knee. She looked down the long sloping clearing that began at the porch step and ran out to where the birches stood in their late yellow. And she thought, $1,200,000 would pay every bill I have, would pay for every fertility procedure I ever wanted to try, and did not have the money for would buy me an apartment in a city with a hospital and a library that did not close, would set me up for the rest of a life I had given up on having. That night, the phone in the cabin rang. It rang only once and then it stopped and she sat very still in the rocking chair. Because the phone had not rung once in the 22 days she had been in the cabin, and she had not been entirely sure it was connected. Then it rang again, and she got up and she crossed the room to the wall, where the old beige handset hung on its cradle, and she lifted it. The voice on the other end was a woman, soft and uncertain, with a slight rasp in it. "Is this Hattie Ellsworth?" the voice said. "It is." The woman hesitated. Then she said something Hattie did not understand at first. She said, "My name is June Holloway. I think your great-uncle Ellis was the only friend my mother ever had. And I think, ma'am, there are some things she told me before she died that you may be the only person left in the world who should hear." She held the receiver against her ear for a long moment before she answered, because the name June Holloway had landed somewhere in her chest, and she needed a second to find out where. "I'm listening," she said finally. June's voice on the other end was the voice of a woman who had been holding a sentence in her mouth for years and was only now letting it out a tone, careful around the edges, like a person carrying water in cupped hands across a long room. "My mother passed 3 months ago," June said. "She was 83. Her name was Margaret Holloway, but she was born Margaret Vale." She paused. Hattie sat down on the floor of the cabin with the phone cord stretched tight across her shoulder. Thaddeus Vale, June said, was her older brother. Hattie did not speak. She could hear on June's end a kitchen clock ticking, and a small refrigerator humming, and the long, careful breaths of an older woman trying to do a hard thing right. "My mother left this state when she was 22, June continued. She never spoke of Thaddeus, not once in 63 years. But in her last week, when the morphine was doing what morphine does, she said his name out loud 3 different times. The third time she said it to me, and she said your great-uncle Ellis Harrowgate up in Linville Hollow knew the truth of what my brother was, and I want you to find him, and I want you to tell him I never blamed him. I want you to tell him I knew. I always knew." Hattie closed her eyes. The cabin was very quiet around her. "So I called the law office in Linville," June said, "and Mr. Aldrich told me Ellis had passed 11 months ago and that there was a niece now in the cabin. And he said with a kind of permission in his voice that if I wanted to write or call you, might be the person who could hear it. So I'm calling. I'm sorry to call so late at night. I'm 71 years old, and I have been sitting at this kitchen table for 4 hours trying to decide whether to dial." Hattie opened her eyes. She said the only thing she could think to say. "You should come." There was a long silence on the other end. Then June said very softly, "I was hoping you'd say that." She came 2 weeks later on the last day of October in a small green hatchback with one suitcase and a quilt her mother had made in 1979 folded across the passenger seat. The leaves had finished coming down by then, and the ridge had taken on the bare brown patient look it would carry into Thanksgiving. Hattie went out to meet her on the porch. June was tall and thin in the way her mother must have been thin, with white hair cut short and steady gray eyes, and a face that had been carrying its own composure for a long time. They stood looking at each other for 1 full second on the porch step. Then June said, "You have her eyes." Hattie said, "Whose?" And June said, "Adaline's. My mother kept a photograph of your grandmother on her dresser for 63 years, and she never told a soul whose face it was. I grew up looking at it. I would know you in a crowd." They sat at the table inside the same table that had once been set for 2 and was now set for 2 again. And June drank tea from the cup Hattie had used on her first night, and she told her things Hattie had not known she still needed to be told. She told her that Margaret Vale had run away from her own brother's house when she was 16 because she had seen what he was and could not unsee it. She told her that Margaret had written a single letter to Adaline in 1961 warning her, and that the letter had gone unanswered because Adaline had been too proud or too afraid or too in love with the version of him she had needed him to be. She told her that when Margaret heard Thaddeus had vanished in 1962, she had felt a relief so large it had frightened her, and she had spent the rest of her life making small private apologies for the relief by being kind to every woman she ever met who had been hurt by a man. I think, June said, looking at her hands, my mother and your grandmother were the same kind of woman. They just got dealt different cards at the table. She lifted her eyes. And I think, Hattie, that the reason I sat at my kitchen 4 hours before I called you was because I have been dealt some cards lately that are starting to look like theirs. Hattie waited. My husband passed in March, June said. We were married 46 years. We had one daughter. She's 42. She lives in Charlotte. 3 weeks ago, she told me she could not have me in the house anymore. She said the medical bills from her father's last year had taken everything, and that her own marriage was struggling, and that she needed me to find somewhere else to be. She did not say it cruelly. She said it crying, but she said it. And I packed what I could into the car, and I sat in a motel in Hickory for 9 nights. And on the 10th night, I called Mr. Aldridge because my mother's voice from the last week of her life had not stopped repeating in my head, and I did not know where else to put my hands. She set the cup down very carefully. I don't expect anything, June said. I don't want anything. I just needed to deliver my mother's message to whoever was left of Ellis. I will stay tonight if you'll have me, and I'll be on the road in the morning. There's a women's housing program in Asheville that has a wait list. I am on the wait list. Hattie looked at her across the table. She looked at the cup. She looked at the rocker by the fireplace. She looked at Barnaby, who had walked over to June's chair and lain down across her feet without being invited the way he had done with Hattie on the first day. She thought about her grandmother, 24 years old, sitting in this same room with a daughter in her arms and a decision to make. She thought about Ellis at 25 sitting across from her. She thought about all the choices that had been made in this cabin by people who had not known whether they were doing right and had done it anyway because someone in front of them had needed a door to walk through. The bedroom at the end of the hall, Hattie said, has clean sheets on it as of yesterday. There are clean towels in the cupboard above the sink. The water is warm if you let it run a full minute. You are welcome to stay tonight. You are also welcome to stay tomorrow. You are welcome, June, to stay as long as the room is more useful to you than to the dust. June's eyes filled. She did not let the tears fall. She only said with a small, precise nod that Hattie understood as the closing of a long door behind her. All right, then. That night, Hattie did not sleep until very late. She sat in the rocking chair with the tin box open beside her on the table, and she read for the first time the sealed envelope she had been saving. It was not addressed to her. It was addressed to Cora. It was a letter Adaline had written in 1990, when Cora would have been 31 and Hattie would have been 4 and Adaline had been 52. Sitting in an apartment in Asheville with a sewing machine on her kitchen table and a window that looked out at a parking lot. The letter had never been mailed. Ellis had been the one to find it in Adaline's apartment after she died, and he had brought it here, and he had put it in the box with everything else, and he had let it wait. Cora, the letter began. I do not know what they have told you about me. I hope they have told you nothing, because nothing is closer to the truth than any of the half things I could have made you carry. I gave you up because I could not have raised you in the shape you deserved. The valley would have looked at you sideways every day of your life, and you would have grown up inside that look, and I could not bear it. I chose for you to grow up loved by people who would never make you wonder whether your own existence was a complicated thing. I have wondered every day for 28 years whether I chose right. I have written you this letter many times in my head. I have never sent it because I am still not sure I have the right. But I want you to know, Cora, in case anyone in your life ever knows enough to give this to you, that I did not stop. I did not stop loving you. I did not stop watching the calendar in October. I did not stop hoping that whatever else you became someone who was held. Your mother always in the place where the name is Adaline. Hattie read it 3 times. On the third time, she read it out loud slowly to the empty front room. The way you read a thing when you want the walls that heard the silence to also hear the answer. Barnaby lifted his head once and put it back down. The lantern light on the table did not flicker. When she was finished, she folded the letter, and she put it back in its envelope, and she did not return it to the tin box. She walked it into the kitchen, and she set it on the small shelf above the stove where Adeline's biscuit recipe was already pinned. Some letters belong in boxes. Some letters belong where bread gets made. In the morning, she made the call to the law firm in Charlotte and told them in the polite, flat voice she had once used at a reference desk that she was declining their offer. She did not need to think about the answer anymore. The answer had been sitting underneath every decision in her life since she had first turned the iron key in the lock. The man on the phone tried twice to revise the figure upward. She let him finish. Then she said, "I understand you have a job to do, and I do not blame you for doing it. But the land was put in trust for me 60 years ago by a woman who walked out of this valley with nothing and made sure I would walk into it with everything. And I am not in the business of unmaking what she did." She thanked him. She hung up. She made coffee. She brought a cup of it down the hall to the second bedroom and knocked softly on the door. And June, who had been awake for an hour and had not wanted to disturb the quiet, opened the door and took the cup and said, "You are very kind," and Hattie said, "No, I am very late." December came. The first real snow fell on the night of December the 8th, soft and thick. The kind of snow that turns the porch rail into a long white shelf and the wood pile into a row of small frosted loaves. June had been with her for 6 weeks by then. She had taken over the mending of clothes, which Hattie had no skill for, and she had begun teaching herself to bake the bread Elaine had once brought up the hill in a paper sack. She had also, on a Tuesday in late November, asked very quietly whether Hattie would mind if she stayed through the winter, because the housing program in Asheville had moved her name back on the list when she missed an intake appointment. And the truth was, she did not want to chase it anymore. Hattie had said stay. She had said it the way her grandmother had once said yes, without negotiation, without an end date. The way a door says yes when it stops being a door and starts being a way in. The snow on December 8th fell all afternoon. By dusk, the gravel turnaround had disappeared under it. Hattie was at the table mending the cuff of an old sweater, because June was teaching her. And June was at the stove turning a pot of bean soup with a wooden spoon, and Barnaby was asleep on the rug in front of the fire when a sound came from the road below. A car climbing slowly in low gear. They both looked up. They both stayed quiet. The car kept climbing. It turned into the drive. It came up the gravel and stopped under the bare oak at the edge of the clearing. A woman got out. She was older than Hattie and younger than June, somewhere in her late 60s, with a thick wool coat and no hat. And she stood for a moment in the falling snow, looking at the cabin, as if she were not sure it was real. Then she walked to the porch step. She climbed it carefully. She knocked. 3 knocks. A pause. 3 more. Hattie opened the door. The woman on the porch had snow in her hair and a small overnight bag at her feet. She had been crying, but not recently. Her face was the face of a person who had used the long drive up the mountain to put her crying away. She said, "I am so sorry to come without calling. My name is Ruth Allard. I worked with Margaret Holloway 30 years ago at a fabric shop in Spartanburg. Margaret wrote me a letter the year before she died and said if I ever found myself unable to go home, I should drive to a cabin in Linville Hollow and ask for a woman named Hattie, and that she would not turn me away. I have spent 2 months not believing the letter. I have spent the last 4 days believing it. I am sorry. I am so sorry to come." Behind Hattie, June had set down the wooden spoon. She came to the door. She looked at Ruth's face for a long second. She said, soft and certain Margaret would have meant it, Then she stepped past Hattie onto the porch, and she picked up Ruth's bag herself, and she said, "Come in out of the cold, honey. We have soup." Ruth came in. The door closed. The cabin held them. Hattie stood for a moment in the entryway with her hand on the iron knob, and she looked up. Above the door, on the inside of the lintel, the wood had been worn smooth by the passing of decades of hands. She had not noticed in any of the 70-some days she had been living in the cabin that the same two words carved on the outside of the lintel had been carved in smaller letters on the inside as well. Hold fast. Two carvings, one for the leaving, one for the coming home. She lifted her fingers and she touched the inside letters very lightly, the way a person touches the forehead of a sleeping child. They were warm from the fire. She understood finally what the words had been all along. Not an order, not a prayer, a handing off. A promise from her grandmother to her great-uncle kept for 63 years. A promise from her great-uncle to her kept through the slow, patient labor of an empty cabin in an empty clearing on an empty ridge. A promise she was now keeping without effort, without ceremony, by the simple act of having opened a door to a stranger in falling snow. The carving had not been telling her to endure. It had been telling her that someone long ago had endured for her, so that one evening in a winter, she could not have imagined she could be the hand that other people endure to find. She turned back to the front room. June was ladling soup into a bowl for Ruth. Ruth was sitting in the rocking chair with her coat still on, and her hands wrapped around a mug that Hattie had set in front of her without remembering doing it. The fire in the stove was steady. The lantern on the table was lit. The cabin smelled of beans and wood smoke, and the faintest trace of dried mint from the tea on the shelf. And somewhere underneath all of that, of a cedar box that had been opened and would not need to be closed again. In the spring, when the snow was gone and the dogwoods at the foot of the ridge were just beginning to think about their white, Hattie took the iron key off the nail by the door and walked it down the hall to the bedroom at the end. She lifted the floorboard. She set the key inside the tin box on top of the notebook, on top of the deed, on top of the small silver bracelet that had once circled a 3-year-old wrist. The box did not need the key anymore. The door did not need it either. The door, she had come to understand, was meant to stay open now. She closed the floorboard. She rolled the rug back over it. She walked out to the porch. June was on the step shelling early peas into a colander. Ruth was halfway down the clearing with Barnaby throwing him a stick he was too old to chase, but too dignified to refuse. The morning light through the new leaves was the color of weak honey. A wren landed on the porch rail and looked at Hattie for one curious second and stayed. If the story has found you tonight, wherever you are listening from, I want to leave you with the question. Hattie left herself the morning she closed the floorboard for the last time. Somewhere in the long quiet years before you were born, someone may have made a choice you will never know about, a choice that cost them more than you will ever be asked to pay, only so that one day you would have a place to stand. And one day, perhaps tomorrow, perhaps in 20 years, a stranger may knock on a door that you did not even know you were keeping open. So tell us in the comments who in your life held fast for you when you did not know it. And for whom are you holding fast tonight without yet being sure they will ever come? Sleep well, the door is open. Thank you for staying with us all the way to the end.